Here's a strange thing happening in the American economy right now. Ask an economist how things are going, and they'll point to a stock market near record highs, unemployment that's still historically low, and headline growth numbers that look completely fine. Ask a random person on the street the same question, and a huge number of them will tell you they're barely keeping up, watching their credit card balance creep higher every month, and wondering how everything got this expensive. Both of these people are right. That's not a contradiction. It's the defining feature of the economy in 2026. Economists have a name for it: the K-shaped economy. One group is going up, another group is going down, and the letter K is literally what it looks like on a chart. Today we're breaking down exactly what's driving this split, who's on which side of it, and, critically, what it means for your own financial decisions going forward. This is part 1. Let's get into it. Let's start with the concept itself, because it explains almost everything else in this video. A normal economic recovery is shaped like AV or AU. Everyone falls together, and everyone recovers together, roughly at the same pace. A K-shaped economy is different. It's when one segment of the population, typically higher earners, asset owners, people with investments, sees their financial position improve, while another segment, typically renters, lower and middle-income workers, people without significant savings or investments, sees their financial position get worse at the exact same time in the exact same economy. Picture the letter K. One line shoots up and to the right. Another line drops down and to the right. Same starting point, completely different trajectories. And this isn't a metaphor economists came up with to sound clever. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York itself, in its own research, has explicitly used this framing to describe what's happening in household finances right now. When the people tracking the data at the highest levels start using this language themselves, that tells you the divide isn't a talking point. It's showing up clearly in the numbers. Here's why this matters more than a normal recession or slowdown would. In a typical downturn, the pain is broadly shared, which, as strange as it sounds, actually makes it easier to talk about, easier to legislate around, easier for people to feel less alone in. A K-shaped economy is quieter and more isolating. If your own finances are stretched thin while the stock market hits new highs and the news says things are fine, it's easy to feel like something is wrong with you specifically, rather than recognizing you're on one particular side of a structural divide. So how do we actually know this divide is real and not just a vibe? The clearest evidence is sitting in the credit card data. As of the second quarter of this year, Americans collectively owe $1.26 trillion in credit card debt. That's a jump of $21 billion in just 3 months, and it's inching right up against last year's all-time record of $1.28 trillion. For context, this number was under $1 trillion just a few years ago. This isn't a slow drift, it's a rapid climb, and it's happening while headline economic indicators look stable. Now here's the part that actually reveals the K-shape, rather than just showing rising debt in general. It's not that everyone is falling behind equally. Late-stage delinquency, meaning balances that are more than 90 days past due, the point where an account is seriously at risk, has climbed sharply, rising from 7.6% to 12.8% of all credit card balances over a period of roughly 2.5 years. That's a huge jump in the share of debt that's genuinely in trouble, even while the overall delinquency rate across most credit products has stayed relatively flat. Read those two numbers together and the picture becomes clear. Total delinquency staying stable sounds reassuring on its own. But if you slice the data differently and look specifically at the worst tier, accounts more than 90 days behind, that share has nearly doubled. That's the K-shape hiding inside a headline number that looks calm. Most people are managing fine, but a growing minority is falling further and further behind, and that group is getting bigger every quarter. Even while the average borrower looks okay on paper, almost half of all cardholders, 47%, currently carry a balance from month to month, meaning they're not paying their card off in full. And this isn't evenly distributed by age either. More than half of Gen X and millennial cardholders carry a balance, compared to a smaller, though still significant, share of Gen Z and boomers. The middle generations, often juggling mortgages, childcare, and the highest cost of living pressures at once, are carrying the heaviest load. None of this is happening in a vacuum. It's being driven by a very specific, very current inflation problem. The Consumer Price Index rose 3.8% over the 12 months ending in April of this year, the largest annual increase since May of 2023. That single number undersells how uneven the pain actually is, because the categories driving that increase are exactly the ones people can't cut back on. Energy prices did the heaviest lifting, with gasoline alone up a staggering 28.4% over the year. Food prices rose 3.2%. Shelter costs, meaning rent and housing, rose 3.3%. Even stripping out food and energy entirely, core inflation still came in at 2.8%, well above the Federal Reserve's own 2% target. Here's why this specific mix of categories matters so much for the K-shape. Gas, groceries, and rent aren't optional purchases you can simply choose to skip. If you're a lower or middle-income household, these three categories eat up a much larger share of your total budget than they do for a higher-income household. So when gasoline jumps nearly 30% in a single year, that hits a family already stretched thin far harder, proportionally, than it hits a household with significant savings and investment income cushioning the blow. And this is precisely the mechanism experts point to when explaining why credit card debt is climbing. As one finance expert put it, prices are rising faster than paychecks for a lot of workers right now. So the credit card increasingly becomes the bridge between what comes in and what has to go out. That's not a description of reckless spending. That's a description of a gap between income and unavoidable costs that more and more households are having to plug with borrowed money every single month just to stay afloat. So here's where things stand after part one. The K-shaped economy isn't a talking point. It's a real, measurable divide, visible in the sharp rise of serious credit card delinquency, even while headline numbers stay calm. And the inflation squeeze driving it, gas, food, and shelter costs rising faster than wages, is hitting exactly the households with the least cushion to absorb it. In part two, we're going to look at who's actually on the upside of this K, why the stock market and the real economy have become disconnected from each other, and, most importantly, the specific moves you can make to protect yourself if you're feeling the downside of this divide. That's next. No recap, no reintro. Picking up exactly where we left off. We've established the divide is real. Now let's talk about who's actually on the upside of this K. Why the stock market feels completely disconnected from everyday life, and exactly what you can do about it. Let's keep going. If you've ever wondered how the stock market keeps hitting record highs while so many people feel like they're falling behind, the answer is that a relatively small group of households is doing most of the economic heavy lifting. And that group has gotten smaller and more concentrated over time. According to Moody's Analytics, the top 20% of earners accounted for 59% of total consumer spending in a recent quarter. Read that again. 1 in 5 households is responsible for nearly 6 out of every $10 spent in the entire economy. That's not a minor tilt. That's an economy where the spending habits of a relatively small, wealthy slice of the population can single-handedly keep growth numbers looking strong, even while the majority of households are pulling back or barely getting by. And it's not just spending, it's wealth itself. As of the most recent data, the top 20% of households held nearly 72% of total household wealth in America. The top 1% alone controlled just over 29% of all aggregate wealth, compared to a mere 5.3% held by the entire bottom half of the country combined. To put that in perspective, 1% of households control roughly 6 times more wealth than the bottom 50% of the country put together. This gap isn't static, it's actively widening. Looking at year-over-year wealth growth by income bracket, the top 20% of households saw their wealth grow at nearly 9% in a recent year. The middle 40% grew at just under 6%, and the bottom 20%, the households most exposed to inflation and least likely to own appreciating assets, grew at only around 4.5%. Every single bracket is technically growing, but the gap between the fastest and slowest growing group is stretching wider every year, which is exactly what AK looks like on a chart. So what's actually driving the wealthy side of this divide upward? Largely, it comes down to asset ownership. Higher-income households are far more likely to own homes, stocks, and retirement accounts, meaning when the stock market rises or home values increase, they directly benefit and compound that wealth further. Lower and middle-income households, who are more likely to rent rather than own, and who often don't have significant investment holdings, simply don't participate in those same gains. When the market goes up, it isn't lifting all boats. It's mostly lifting the boats that were already floating comfortably. This helps explain one of the most confusing parts of the current economy. Why does the stock market keep setting records while everyday costs keep squeezing regular households? Part of the answer is that a huge share of recent stock market gains has been concentrated in a narrow slice of companies. Specifically, businesses tied to artificial intelligence spending and infrastructure. The market's headline strength is being fueled disproportionately by a handful of massive companies riding the AI investment wave, not by broad-based economic health spreading evenly across every sector and every household. When people hear the market is at an all-time high, it's easy to assume that reflects the health of the overall economy. In reality, it increasingly reflects the performance of a concentrated group of companies and the wealth of the shareholders who already own the most stock. Disproportionately, again, the top of the income distribution. You can even see this divide play out directly in which companies are thriving and which are struggling. Airlines and retailers catering specifically to higher income, discretionary travelers and shoppers have posted strong results, while companies dependent on everyday, budget-conscious consumers have had a rockier time. Wealthier households have kept increasing discretionary spending on things like travel, luxury goods, and entertainment, even as lower and middle-income households pull back on exactly those categories to protect their budgets for essentials. The same economy is simultaneously rewarding companies selling premium experiences and squeezing companies that depend on stretched, budget-conscious customers. There is a small silver lining worth mentioning, because the picture isn't entirely bleak. Some recent data suggests the gap may be leveling off slightly. Consumers with lower credit scores have actually seen their financial health indicators improve at the fastest pace in a couple of years, and the overall spending gap between high and low-income households has started to narrow somewhat, partly due to a stronger labor market and earlier tax refunds this year. That doesn't mean the divide has closed. It's still wide. But it's a signal that this isn't necessarily a one-way, ever-widening spiral. Improved job conditions specifically for lower-income workers appear to be doing more to help than anything else right now. So if you're on the harder side of this K right now, here's what actually matters practically. First, separate what you can control from what you can't. You can't personally fix inflation, interest rates, or the broader wealth concentration happening at a national level. What you can control is how deliberately you respond to it inside your own budget. That distinction matters because a lot of financial anxiety right now comes from feeling powerless against forces that are, genuinely, largely outside any individual's control. Focusing your energy on the parts you can actually influence is not naive optimism. It's the only lever that actually moves. Second, if you're carrying credit card debt, understand that the interest rate on that debt is your single biggest controllable expense right now. Credit card APRs remain near record highs, which means carrying a balance month to month is more expensive today than it's been in a long time. If you have a balance, look specifically at whether a balance transfer to a lower or zero interest card, or a fixed-rate personal loan to consolidate the debt, could meaningfully cut what you're paying in interest alone, separate entirely from the amount you actually owe. Interest is where debt quietly grows fastest, and it's often the most fixable piece. Third, revisit your essential spending categories specifically. The ones driving this inflation squeeze the hardest. Gasoline, groceries, and housing are the categories doing the most damage to stretched budgets right now. That doesn't mean dramatic lifestyle overhauls are required, but even modest, deliberate changes in these specific categories. Route planning to cut gas costs, batch grocery shopping to reduce trips and impulse buys, negotiating or shopping around on renewal for major recurring costs like insurance, tend to matter more right now than cutting back on smaller discretionary spending that isn't actually driving your budget stress. Fourth, if you're not currently able to invest or build assets, don't let that become a reason to disengage entirely from long-term planning. The wealth gap in this K-shaped economy is driven heavily by asset ownership, stocks, real estate, retirement accounts, compounding over time. Even a small, consistent contribution to a retirement account, however modest, starts putting you on the asset-owning side of that equation rather than being purely dependent on wage income alone. The amount matters far less than starting the habit as early as possible. Fifth, watch the labor market signals more than the stock market headlines. Given that wage growth and job market conditions, specifically for lower and middle-income workers, appear to be one of the more meaningful forces narrowing this gap recently, your own job security and wage growth prospects are a more relevant economic indicator for your household than whatever the S&P 500 did this week. If you're in a position to negotiate a raise, build additional skills, or explore better-paying opportunities, that's arguably a more direct lever on your side of the K than almost anything else on this list. Here's the honest summary. The K-shaped economy isn't a conspiracy theory or a talking point. It's a real, measurable divide, backed by the Federal Reserve's own data, showing rising serious delinquency, record credit card debt, and a wealth gap that keeps widening even as headline numbers look calm. A relatively small, asset-owning slice of the population is driving both the stock market's records and a disproportionate share of consumer spending, while a much larger group is quietly falling further behind. If your own financial life feels harder than the headlines suggest it should, that's not a personal failing. It's a structural pattern showing up in real data, and you're far from alone in it. What actually helps is focusing on what's controllable. The interest rate on your debt, the categories eating your budget the fastest, and building even a small foothold in asset ownership over time. If this helped you make sense of what's actually going on right now, let me know in the comments which side of the K you feel like you're on. And subscribe for more breakdowns cutting through the confusion on the financial stuff that actually affects your life.